Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on becoming Mexican American. In the chapter this week, we see the how basically the Southwest was, the U.S. Southwest was created and became part of the United States, and the impact that had on the populations that were already there. So in the 1820s, Anglos began to move into Texas, which is at the time a part of Mexico. So in essence, Anglos crossed the border illegally into what is Mexican land, settle and bring slaves with them. Realizing that Anglo settlement in Texas was a threat to Mexico, the Mexican government outlawed slavery and further immigration of Anglos in 1830. However, the Mexican elite are against this and favor keeping an open border because they see economic opportunity in creating business collaborations with Americans. Nonetheless, Anglos continued to move into Texas illegally, and by 1835, they outnumber the Mexican population. So in 1836, Americans begin an armed insurrection in Texas that culminates in the Battle of the Alamo, which you may be familiar with or have heard about before, where 175 rebels barricade themselves in the Alamo. General Santa Anna from Mexico storms the Alamo, killing most of the rebels. Sam Houston organizes a counterattack and captures Santa Anna and forces him to cede Texas. And then Texas becomes an independent republic. In 1845, the US annexes Texas and Texas becomes part of the United States. The Mexican-American War then arises out of a dispute between Mexico and the US over the Texas border, where the US argued it was the Rio Grande and Mexico argued it was 150 miles to the north in the Nueces River. American troops are ordered into this disputed territory, provoking war with Mexico. However, the real reason for war was US desire for California. There was this increasing desire for the United States borders to go all the way to the West Coast so that they could have access to the ports in California and to a lot of the resources that were available in California. The Texan victory results in more desire for westward expansion, fueled now by the additional idea of manifest destiny, the notion that it was the US's God-given right to expand. Manifest destiny, which was coined in 1845 by John O'Sullivan, who believed in the expansion of the US into Latin America, particularly Cuba, where he had financed filibustering attempts, was a philosophy expounded through some of the publications of the day. Quote, "To the Caucasian race is the world indebted for all the great and important discoveries, inventions, and improvements that have been made in science and the arts." Dr. George Caldwell, a phrenologist of the time, also espoused manifest destiny, and this was a quote from him. Another leader in such thinking was Dr. Josiah C. Knight, who proclaimed, quote, "Wherever in the history of the world the inferior races have been conquered and mixed in with the Caucasian, the latter have sunk into barbarism." So he urged the need for eugenics to keep the white race pure. So even though there's, on the one hand, this ideology around having a God-given right to expand to the West Coast, there was also a racial ideology embedded within that around what to do and how to think about those non-white folks that were in those lands. So with the foundation in racist ideology, the expansionist right was a Caucasian right, not just a national right. The war ends in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, according to which the land of the far north would become part of the US, but the rights and property of the residents of said frontier were to be guaranteed. Mexico accepted the Rio Grande as the border, ceding all lands above that border to the United States. However, there is concern in the US over the inferiority of the Mexican population, so they strategically make sure to take the least populated of Mexican lands, even though during the war, the war ends because Mexico City is captured by the US Army. As you notice in the map, but we did not go all the way down to Mexico City to capture the rest of Mexico. We only focused on the northern parts of Mexico because these areas were the least populated. And the rest of the land that is now part of the Southwest is purchased through the Gadsden Purchase of 1853 that ends up capturing those small portions that you see in the map that had been left out in the treaty. Although the treaty guaranteed Mexicans who remain in the Southwest citizenship rights, laws were put in place that undermined their rights. For instance, in California, an anti-vagrancy law was passed known as the Greaser Act, which defined vagrants as all persons who were commonly known as greasers or the issue of Spanish or Indian blood and who went armed and were not peaceable and quiet persons. And you can think about how subjective that description is of, who gets to decide who is commonly known as a greaser, who gets to decide whether people are quiet enough or not, peaceable enough or not. The foreign miners tax, which is passed in 1850 in California during the gold rush, gives Anglo miners an advantage because they did not have to pay this tax. So this was another way in which to control and disadvantage the Mexican population that was already in those areas. American land laws required being able to prove ownership and clear borders to one's land. So this, which did not exist under Mexican law, and therefore many landowners lost their lands because they couldn't prove that those lands belonged to them based on American law. These lands then became available to Anglos. Also, counties in the state of Texas created white primaries to disenfranchise Mexicans from voting. Additional laws were passed, which made it difficult for Mexicans to hold onto their lands. And the new system of land taxation also impacted Mexican land ownership. So through a number of measures, Mexicans were displaced from their land, and the rights that had been promised through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo were being taken away. The last loss of land results in their becoming agricultural workers. In the 1880s, Mexicans become the largest workforce in building the Texas and Mexican Railroad. Many found themselves in a caste labor system where Anglos were either paid more than they were for the same work or they were assigned to more dangerous jobs. Many lived in company-owned towns relying on the company store and found themselves owing the company more than they earned. This may sound familiar from when we talked about post-emancipation, the experiences of African Americans who ended up working in plantations as a labor force, but also ended up owing more to their employers than they earned because of these company stores and being required to use those stores to purchase whatever goods they needed for their everyday lives. There were also, though, forms of labor resistance. In 1901, in the El Paso Electric Streetcar Company strike, Mexican construction workers went on strike. They demanded wage increases and that the company stop replacing them with lower wage Mexican workers. They didn't earn the rise, but did get the company to stop importing workers from Mexico. In 1903, at the Clifton Morenzi mines in California, 3,500 workers, mostly Mexican Americans, went on strike. They demanded an 8-hour day, free hospitalization, paid life insurance, fair prices at the company store, and the end of this dual wage system. The strike, however, was quelled by the Arizona Rangers. If you've heard of the Texas Rangers, these are the same thing in the state of Arizona. Several strike leaders were convicted of inciting a riot and sent to prison. And so this undermined their work, the workers' movement. We also saw in the reading that there are coalitions created with Japanese farm workers in California, and also organizing strikes with fellow Japanese farm workers. So there is a long history of labor resistance by Mexican laborers in the United States. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to seeing your discussion posts. Have a good week.